Welcome everyone and welcome back for the final event in our Migrations Initiative Spring 2022 series. I'm Eleanor Painter, postdoctoral associate in migrations with the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies, and it's such a pleasure to welcome you here today for our keynote, Cooking in Our Kitchens, Histories of Experiential and Ontological Knowledge Production in the Arts of the Americas. This keynote features a team of scholars and artists who we'll introduce in just a moment. Today's speakers will share from their powerful collaborative work to round out this series of talks that have brought very different disciplinary lenses to the relationship between racism, dispossession, and migration. And in recognition of this relationship and of our own varied places in connection with the historical and ongoing dispossession of Indigenous lands and peoples, I'll open today's event with a land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. And I read and reflect on this acknowledgement as part of my own process of learning as a white settler in these spaces, and offer it here while encouraging those of you joining us online today or watching this later to also take a moment and reflect on the land and places from which you're joining our conversation. And I hope that with today's event, we might also have a chance to return to the place of land acknowledgements in the context of a webinar focused on place-based knowledge and artistic practice. Many thanks to the eCornell team for producing today's event and this whole series, and please stay tuned for future Migrations Initiative events, podcast episodes, and other resources via our website and newsletter, which you can find at migrations.cornell.edu. And thanks to you all for being with us today. And I'll share just a couple of technical notes and then we'll move into today's presentations and discussion. This event is being recorded and will be available at this same URL afterward. You can submit questions in the chat, which you can open by clicking the dialog box at the top right of your video player. We will save plenty of time for your questions and encourage you to keep posting them throughout the presentations today. And throughout our discussion, we'll also be sharing URLs and resources in the chat. If you're watching the archived recording, those links are available in the overview section just below. I'll now hand it over to my co-moderator today, Catherine Foster. Catherine is a PhD candidate in development sociology at Cornell University's College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. Their research focus is on population and development, specifically revolving around the demographic shifts caused by the climate crisis. And they've also worked with the team presenting today. Over to you, Kate.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eleanor. Today, I have the privilege of introducing our 4 panelists, beginning with Ella Maria Diaz, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Literatures in English and Latina and Latino Studies program at Cornell University. Her work focuses largely on Chicana and Chicano art, poetry, performance, and political activism. Our next panelist, Ananda Cohen Aponte, is a professor of history of art at Cornell University, who works in the visual culture of colonial Latin America with special interest in issues of cross-cultural exchange, identity, and anti-colonial movements. Our third panelist, Jolene Rickard, is an associate professor in the Departments of History of Art and the former director of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program from 2008 to 2020 at Cornell University. She is a visual historian, artist, and curator interested in the intersection of Indigenous knowledge and contemporary art, materiality, and eco-criticism, with an emphasis on the Haudenosaunee aesthetic. Jolene is from the Tuscarora Nation and Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Sandy Rodriguez is a Chicana artist and researcher who is Los Angeles-based. Her work investigates the methods and materials of painting across cultures and histories. Her work focuses on the intersections of history, social memory, contemporary politics, and cultural production. Rodriguez's work is featured in 5 concurrent museum exhibitions in 2022, and her work has been featured broadly in places such as BBC News, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Spectrum One News, Latinos Who Lunch, and Modern Art Notes. We are very lucky to have these panelists here with us today, and I will turn to my colleague, Ella Maria Diaz, who is at the table to begin our discussion.
Thank you so much, Kate, for the introductions of all of us together. And thank you, Eleanor, for the opening and the acknowledgements. So today we begin with a question. How is the contemporary ecological crisis an ongoing outcome of the colonial violences that have shaped and continue to shape the lands of what we call the Americas? One moment, if you could go back to the first slide. To answer this question, our team, which began with Dr. Ananda Koana-Ponte, Dr. Jolene Rickard, and myself, Dr. Ella Maria Diaz, centered ourselves in the knowledge we embody both professionally through our academic training and empirically through our distinct cultural heritages set against the institutions in which we live and work. We represent 3 generations of women of color scholars who have asked and answered this question in our research and in our teaching. We came together beginning in the summer of 2021 to co-create our framework, then inviting Chicana artist Sandy Rodriguez, among other artists, community partners, and students to co-think and co-create an immersive learning environment that addresses intersecting histories of Indigenous, Chicanx, and Latinx place-based knowledges and ontology through the lens of the visual, textual, and performative arts. Moving between what I call convivencia, comida, and conversation, or the 3 C's, which pertains to relational models of knowledge creation through shared meals, intimate space making, and informal discussions, we walked on the traditional homelands of the Gayocojono, the Cayuga Nation, and a central New York farm of an Afro-Latino Boricua farmer. Members of our migrations grant team visited and worked with collections at Olin Library and the Johnson Museum of Art, inviting students and community partners to discuss institutional holdings from their experiences of school, work, family, and cultural memory. Looking at institutional collections in this way makes visible their ongoing relationships to histories of resilience, survivance, and resistance among Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Faculty in the College of Human Ecology at Cornell, their labs and students were also engaged, as Sandy Rodriguez shared her recipes for organic colorants that are based on records of the 16th century Florentine Codex, contemporary ethnobotanical training and field studies, family knowledge, as well as partnerships with Indigenous artists and elders in Los Angeles and the larger southwestern region of the United States. Moreover, we engage Cornell faculty who direct programs that serve New York State's farm working communities, convene knowledge holders of Indigenous languages, and held student-centered events at the Latino Living Center and Alice Cook House. Distilling several of the larger stakes of our interdisciplinary research model to de-center Western and Eurocentric traditions of knowledge production in institutional spaces and in our everyday lives at the university, we stewed and brewed, cooking our ideas together as we transform them into interdisciplinary knowledge of historical forces of power that shape what we know and how we know it and why. Therefore, our visual film and recorded archive, which will be available on our website, is an essential ingredient of the dissemination of our research. The history of kitchen spaces is a long one for BIPOC communities. It both predates and extends throughout intersecting eras of colonial labors and into nations with capitalist systems of consumption. Now, at the end of our 3-week research journey, we asked ourselves, what does cooking in our kitchens mean to us? And we use the kitchen space in this conversation as a tactic of oppositional consciousness in which we redeploy the kitchen, reconfiguring its domestication under patriarchal systems of power and the colonial logic of binaries for gendered labor. So put another way, next slide, please. Why do some kitchens get called labs and recipes get called formulas or equations? What is data? What are methods? What are they in relation to intergenerational memory? What is the implicit bias we put on bodies of knowledge and the usage of these words? And I ask because my knowledge has been deeply wounded in its compartmentalization of this, but not that. I inherited a legacy of binaries as a first-generation professor and ex-working class Chicana, a person made out of historical forces of power resulting in diaspora. And I am not from here nor there, having been split at the root, as one of my favorite poets, Adrienne Rich, once explained to me at 18 years of age in my first quarter of college at UC Santa Cruz. It would take me decades to grow into her foundational essay among the many writings from queer and women of color authors, artists, and theorists. Cooking in our kitchens for me means kitchen table women of color press, an intellectual intervention on our systems of thought that was just remembered and celebrated here at Cornell by the Words Walking Without Masters, Conversations on the Creative Theoretical, a symposium planned by PhD students Jahan Robeson and Shakoya Kidwell in the Department of Literatures and English, which included the press founder Barbara Smith. Kitchen Table Press is a lived and living example of the remediation, the reassembly of embodied knowledge and the academic one. Next slide. reframing the labors that were conscripted, extracted, and forced on women under the guise of tradition, heritage, and culture. Kitchen Table Women of Color Press, among a late 20th century history of publication spaces for Chicanx, queer, and women of color voices, offered new models and new methods, not exclusive to cis white women, but rather an epistemological tradition grounded in experiential knowledge. It's that learning by doing and being in and of the Americas and sharing this knowledge through multiple means of communication, the remedios, the concoctions, the recipes, the chemistries of our knowledge. This is a central visual theme of Chicana artist and elder Dr. Amalia Mesa Baines' Curanderas Botanica, an installation that resonates deeply in Sandy Rodriguez's practice, as well as her exhibition choices to date. Next slide, please. Words and image have always been the language of the Chicana tradition of knowledge making because of the historical fusions of art, languages, cultures, and belief systems occurring in the 16th century to the present, producing an art of the contact zone where cultures meet, clash, and converge, often in different relationships to power. And here we see Dr. Mesa Baines' installation of an ancestor circle centered on orality and dialogical relationships to knowledge, then becoming the cover of the 2001 book, Telling to Live, published by the Latina Feminist Group. And this is the perfect place then for me to stop and to turn to my colleague, Nandi Conaponte, who sits at the table with us.
Thank you so much, Ella, for that beautiful discussion. And I hope to add on some further thoughts from my own perspective, working at in the field of pre-Columbian and colonial Latin American art history. So if we could go to the next slide. So the two images that you see on your screen here are foundational images in my own field. They were both produced relatively contemporaneously, but capturing drastically different histories of migration. The one on the left represents the Mexica migration into the Valley of Mexico. And Mexica was the term used, that was the term used by the founders of the Aztec Empire, by the term that they're known most popularly as. And this migration is shown in a highly symbolic way using Aztec pictographs, showing their departure from their mythical homeland of Aztlan, crossing the lagoon, led by their patron deity Huitzilopochtli, or Hummingbird of the South, and then migrating into central Mexico, which is denoted by the glyph on the right, in the year 1 Flint, which is labeled in between these two scenes in the picture. And 1 Flint corresponded to the year 1111 AD. And about a century and a half later, the Mexica would eventually establish their empire of Tenochtitlan, which then became supplanted by Mexico City, the capital of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, and of course, the current capital of the country of Mexico. The image on the right is also representing migration, but in a highly fictionalized and very politically charged manner. This is Jan van der Straat's Amerigo Vespucci Discovers America from the late 16th century. And nearly every single element of the image is entirely fantastical, and in many ways sets the tone for the construction and invention of what we call America. You see a supine naked woman lounging on a hammock, which I should mention is a Taino technology, but not showcasing the tremendous achievements of the Taino, but instead showing her awakening from her slumber by the erect male image of Vespucci, surrounded by this very chaotic scene of plants and animals and human sacrifice in the background. And really, these counterposed narratives and the epistemological formations that foreground them serve for me as an important point of departure as I think about my role in this project around migrations and place-based knowledge. If we could go to the next slide. And I just bring in here a canonical painting from my own field of specialty, which is colonial Latin American art. And the portrait that you see on the left is of Doña Mariana Belsunce y Salazar, is currently located in the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And it represents a criolla, a woman of Spanish descent who has lived many generations in the Americas. Is from the 18th century. There's a whole history behind this painting that I won't be able to get into for the purposes of this discussion. But suffice to say that this is a very canonical image from colonial Latin America, showing this white woman bedecked in a very fancy dress, with a window that overlooks a park that she and her late husband had been in charge of constructing and patronizing. She is surrounded by all sorts of indicators and indices of wealth and status, including a pocket watch, silver, other type, a mahogany desk, and so forth. And she's wearing, of course, the most the nicest and most fashion forward kinds of accessories and dress on her body. And one of the most important interventions that has been happening in my field is to think about the invisible histories of Indigenous and Black exploited and enslaved labor that made possible this wealth and refinery. And these are the histories that get elided and erased in these types of portraits. So by placing this image in juxtaposition and conversation with indigo processing, with cochineal harvesting, with the silver mines of Potosi, it can at least give us a bit of a sense of what it took in terms of Indigenous and Black labor, ecological knowledge, and aesthetic mastery to be able to create what we know as, these luxury goods and luxury cultures. If we could go to the next slide. But one of the things that I've been thinking a lot more about is, how do we continue to push this framework? And I've been deeply inspired by contemporary artists like Sandy Rodriguez and like Titus Kaphar. And this is a painting called Enough About You from 2016. That was a really important intervention into the University Museum at Yale, the Yale Center for British Art. Because as you can see from the image to the right, this is a close-up shot of the enslaved boy who is in the dark recesses of the corner of a scene from a painting from 1708 of Elihu Yale seated at the table with the second Duke of Devonshire and Lord James Cavendish. And so when we're thinking about the creation of the institution of Yale University, and its indebtedness to slave labor, the role of Kaphar in making those histories visible and palpable is a really important intervention that forces us not only to think differently about contemporary art, but to think differently about the formation of the Americas and how we can think and see 18th century paintings in new ways. And I think that Sandy's work is really visionary in that conversation. And the final slide that I wanted to end with is just, I tend to lead with my expertise and I tend to lead with the material that I specialize in. And it's very rare that I dig into my own personal story. But I really think that when we're thinking about different ontologies of knowledge and different ways of thinking about how we arrive at what we call expertise, for me, it's important to also ground myself within these histories of migration in the Americas. I'm the daughter of a Jewish father whose ancestors escaped the pogroms of Eastern Europe, and the Cuban mother who has had a very complex migration story that brought her to the United States in the early 1960s through something called Operation Peter Pan. And this brought her from Matanzas, Cuba, to an orphanage in St. Louis, Missouri, to San Juan, Puerto Rico, to Miami, Florida, and beyond. And I never really thought about my mother's work as also part of my intellectual formation until I started this project. And she began her work actually as a social worker, helping Mexican-American families in California. And then later has become a prolific antiques dealer. Please follow her on Instagram, Maria_antiques. But I never thought of my mom as an art historian. She would drag me to flea markets all the time. And it's only, now many years later and decades later that I realized, she also specializes in these arts of the object. And I think that is profound to consider her own migration story, coming to the US with nothing but the clothes on her back, to being a collector and purveyor of material knowledge. And so it's in her debt that I really owe my own success. So I'm going to pass it to my esteemed colleague, Jolene Rickard, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in the Q&A.
Thanks. Thanks to you, Nandi, Ella, Eleanor, and Kate, for setting this evocative table. What does cooking in the kitchen mean to us? First, I conceptualize the world as my kitchen. The provocation of this question has prompted me to focus on Indigenous knowledge within the climate crisis discussion at an impasse. I observe the rapid transmission of harnessing Indigenous ideas, often without acknowledgement, as becoming part of the broader discussion within areas of research like sustainability, environmental, and technology studies. The use of an Indigenous concept of relationships to other than human beings is now common in academic spaces. The question of relationship is key in rethinking how we move forward in an equitable and sustainable way within the Americas and globally. Not only relationships to other than human beings, which provides a basis for thinking beyond human-centeredness in the moment of the epoch identified as the Anthropocene, but it also asks us to consider relationships to each other as Indigenous, BIPOC, settler, and arrivant peoples. As Indigenous and specifically Haudenosaunee peoples, we've been asserting a pathway to create an equitable relationship between the first peoples of the Americas and both settlers and arrivants. The protocol of the two-row wampum, or Gasentwa, sets a framework to build a socially just framework within the Americas at early contact. This belt symbolizes the agreement and conditions under which the Haudenosaunee welcomed the newcomers to this land. Our relationship to place was acknowledged by Hunit Degayas, or George Washington, and addressed to the Seneca Nation in 1790. He stated, "Here then is the security for the remainder of your lands. No state nor person can purchase your lands unless at some public held treaty under the authority of the United States. The general government will never consent to your being defrauded, but it will protect you in all your just rights." The settlers, next slide, please. The settler states in the Americas have not kept their agreements in these relationships by enacting multiple forced dispossessions of Indigenous peoples across the Americas. Migrations are not only external to the Americas, but an ongoing rupture and trauma for Indigenous peoples and allied arrivants within the Americas. Cooking in our kitchens requires new intellectual ingredients and actions, making our bodies the active agents in the ongoing assertion of holding ground in the Americas. Next slide, please. Mohawk artist Alan Michelson calls our attention to the northern border between the US and Canada, but also a marker of colonization within the land of the Haudenosaunee, whose territory historically was in both settler states of Canada and the United States. This artwork reminds us of the original agreement of Gaswenta and it can only be seen if you're detained in the border checkpoint. Next slide, please. In Haudenosaunee territories, the work continues to rekindle the Gaswenta, or two-row protocol, as relationship. To return to the original observation about the use of the phrase relationship to other than human beings, it is also accounted for in the two-row protocol. The two purple lines represent indigenous, settler, and arrivant worldviews, and the white row between is the river of life. The phrase relationships to other than human beings is about our mutual responsibility to this space. How is this phrase understood across multiple philosophical standpoints? What is the quality of aliveness that informs indigenous thinking, and how does it relate to the environment? This research collaboration recognizes that indigenous cultures have eloquently embedded observational place-based knowledge in all aspects of our expressive and material culture. This research brought together key Haudenosaunee and other indigenous knowledge holders with this co-creative collaborative group of indigenous and allied scholars to lay claim to an indigenous theorization of active matters as holding ground in academia and impacting representations of migration, environmental, and sustainable discourses. I argue that indigenous ontologies of the material world encompass material science, philosophy, history, and art, formulating provisional sets of variable and overlapping ways of being active. These are not discrete types or classifications to which specific objects belong, but different qualities of activity we might recognize in them. For indigenous people, objects, or at least certain objects and materials, were never thought of as static, but rather as both active subject and as subject to interconnecting webs of animating force and relationality. The root of this idea is in dialogue with indigenous cross-disciplinary movements referred to as new materialism, including object-oriented ontologies and speculative realism, actor network theory, agential realism, vibrant matter, or new vitalism, or string theory, and string theory. The turn towards ontological concerns through materiality is a more recent site of investigation between art and indigeneity. Scholars who are addressing this intersection include allied scholar Fred Myers and Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee scholar Vanessa Watts in Indigenous Place, Thought, and Agency Among Humans and Non-Humans, or First Woman and Sky Woman Go on a European World Tour. The use of the idea of ontology as active matter was demonstrated by Onondaga linguist Dr. Kevin Conley by spilling a glass of water accidentally on a table in an undergraduate class at Cornell University during a guest lecture in a course titled Indigenous Ingenuities as Living Networks. The quotation marks here significant that it isn't an accident, but considered part of a demonstration of a key concept in Haudenosaunee philosophy that can be expressed in Haudenosaunee languages. The water spill illustrates a linguistic concept called aspect, a property of or rule embedded in most indigenous or polysynthetic languages. The discipline of structural linguistics labels aspect a key property for understanding indigenous ideas about time that can be found in the conceptual architecture of our languages. The spill was part of a broader set of demonstrations calling for the need to recognize a different philosophical ordering of time and space within an indigenous worldview. Dr. Conley arrested student attention with this action, but the underlying point was that time is a representation of reality is fluid, not static or fixed. Inevitably, a revised comprehension of time will be demanded in order to understand material and expressive culture rooted in indigenous, Chicana, Black, and Latinx philosophies. These examples and location within academic discipline illustrate the need to move the discussion forward concerning the relationship to other than human beings and the physical or material world through an indigenous philosophical lens. We need to move both kinds of relationships forward, the relationship to the earth as a living being, but also to each other. Next slide, please. I'm reminded that in our own backyard, set against the most profound migration in indigenous and Haudenosaunee land, is the return to the Gaekono or Cayuga people to their homeland. They are met with racism and now allies who are working with them to rematriate their land. Cooking in our kitchen seeks to recenter Haudenosaunee indigenous knowledge and BIPOC observational experiences as vital to the ongoing formation of global knowledges in the 21st century. Miawa for your consideration of my cooking in the kitchen, and I'm pleased to invite our visiting collaborator, Sandy Rodriguez.
Thank you so much. Next slide, please. Here we go. Just setting my timer. So I'm just going to speak for about 6 minutes, and if we can go to the next slide, we'll begin with close looking at a map that's called De los Tender Age Detention Centers, Family Separations, and Other Atrocities. This is a map that is created as part of my ongoing series, the Codex Rodriguez Mondragon. The Codex Rodriguez Mondragon began in 2017 and is an ongoing series that maps the ongoing cycles of violence on communities of color by blending historical and recent events. These maps are made with hand-processed earth pigments, plant material, and insect-based watercolors on a sacred and once outlawed amate paper, a testament to the indigenous artistic traditions of the Americas. Recovering the medicinal and aesthetic uses of native plants enables my work to support the healing awareness building of current and historic traumas. This labor-intensive process of interdisciplinary research requires extensive field study, historical and ethnobotanical, with the urgency to address the current crisis in the United States and the US-Mexico border. This particular map was created at the height of the news stories and news cycles around the proliferation of child detention centers that took place in 2018. During that time period, I had the opportunity to conduct field study in Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico. Those are the locations on this map where you will find painted landscape views with native plants that are endemic to the region. Each one of the states in this particular view are painted in a different colorant that has a symbolic power, whether it is processed from a vascular plant, capturing both the life force and the spiritual and symbolic uses of it, or whether it is a mineral colorant that is more in line with the methods and materials of painting throughout this region. The edge of the map has various types of outlines that reference the 1848 land grab of the Western US according to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. There are a number of references that collapse both time and space. And as I mentioned, the work is very interdisciplinary and that there is a very intensive research on colonial Mexican 16th century manuscripts. So a number of the elements, including the weeping women, the enslaved families, both on the California coast and in Texas, as well as a number of the fauna, are from a historic image. The contemporary images in this map will be the immigration detention centers that are overpopulated with thousands of unaccompanied minors children sleeping under emergency blankets, and then the small purple markers all across this part of the Western United States are standing in for the locations of those child detention centers. There are a number of historic images, but that bring us into our present day, including the image that's off to the right of a ship that's called the Uss Emancipation that was used during the 1950s under Operation Wetback, where migrants, American-born Latinos, were captured, caged, and then forcibly removed via train to Texas, and then sent to Veracruz, Mexico, as part of an agreement with past policies. So this is just an example of the type of work that is part of the Codex Rodriguez Mondragon and that informs the work that I'm doing here with our esteemed colleagues, Dr. Diaz, Dr. Cohen Aponte, Dr. Rickard, and the amazing students and resources that we've had a chance to visit over the past 12 days. Next slide. As I mentioned, my work is very much investigating historic materials of the Americas. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a number of pigments that have been foraged, gifted, or purchased for the processing of watercolors that I'm using to create these maps. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a page from the Florentine Codex, which is a 2,000-page colonial document that has informed so much of my research. Here you'll see an image of the processing of nochesli, or cochinilla, or bebia, also called cochineal in English. It is created at a moment when the populations are having to sequester themselves because of an epidemic that's wiping out almost 90% of the indigenous population, just one generation after the invasion and conquest of Mexico. It is this, along with experiments in my kitchen, that take place for color extraction, for the processing of plant and insect material. Next slide. It has been over the past few months that I've had an opportunity to do color demonstrations in person and not just on Zoom, as have been the kind of way in which we've navigated over the pandemic. But here's a slide that includes a scene of myself and my curator at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art processing colors and creating the lecture hall as a kitchen, a laboratory of generating and sharing out practices of color production that are a result of deep knowledge and relationships with plants and communities of a specific region. Next slide. Over the past 11 days here in Ithaca, I've had an opportunity to do two different color demonstrations with students. One in a conference room where I included a number of organic colorants that are native to this region, including acorn caps and milkweeds. We had an opportunity to share knowledge from a variety of perspectives with students from various areas, allowing for this cross-pollination and informing of how these materials are viewed differently. It is my absolute joy to have spent opportunity or to have spent time in libraries and museums over dinners with students, with your faculty, and to really engage with this place and to learn about this contested land in which I'm working for the next few days as part of this residency. But cooking in our kitchens for me really is about that dialogue, that space in between, the reflecting upon all of these experiences, and being out here at Rocky Acres in front of the bodega, in front of an outdoor kitchen, is really just absolutely nourishing. And so I'm just going to go ahead and wrap it there because I see we are at time. So thank you so very much.
Thanks to all of today's presenters. This is such a rich set of talks, and thank you for all that you've shared with us so far. We're shifting now to the discussion part of the webinar. And so if you're joining us live, feel free to add questions to the chat box there, and we're happy to pull those in as they come in. While you're posting those questions to sort of shift us into discussion, I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to say a little bit more about this team coming together. And Sandy, you just mentioned a few of the things that you've been doing during your residency here. So maybe I'll turn it back to you, and maybe also to Ella to start to say a little bit more about the vision of this collaborative interdisciplinary project as a whole.
Sandy?
Well, I'd love to hear from Ella, because I think that there's so much that was envisioned, and I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation, but it is through this intergenerational knowledge that meaning is made. When I have an opportunity to go deeper within these conversations with Dr. Cohen-Aponte, with Dr. Diaz and Dr. Rickard, and their students, being able to really share knowledge and then understand kind of where students have connections into their own areas of study and where knowledge is being passed back and forth and applied, allows for me to really understand how the various entry points into the work that we're doing can be expanded. But it's really that in-between time that allows me to see more clearly and think more clearly.
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, it's an important question. I love everything that I've heard today, and parts of it made me emotional as the different approaches to talking about this, what we're willing to reveal and what we're revealing for the first time, how we stage the conversation. I won't reveal anything said over our comidas that were not photographed or filmed, but there were other stories that were shared in those moments about how families came into being from older generations by us. And that, I think, actually played a role today in some of the ways in which other stories were told. And I know that my colleague and I spent some time on the phone talking about our own origin stories after one dinner in particular. The reason I say all of that is because of the idea of convivencia, like existence, being together, and how this beautiful word that means so much to me in Chicana epistemology, particularly through education fields, I think it's been the most developed there. In Chicana and Chicano educational praxis, but how that word really sort of, well, I'll say it is synonymous with ontology in many ways, the relationships between subjects and their objects, or objects in relationship to subjects, and the way that that really gets compartmentalized and split at the root. And I love throwing a little Adrienne Rich in there, because as a Chicana, it's funny to me, I hope some folks of different generations pick up on the humor that my consciousness of Chicanidad and my Chicana identity comes to me from multiple trajectories, and Adrienne Rich being one of them. An essay about her identity as a Jewish woman who is lesbian and coming up in sort of a heteronormative culture brought me into one of my first steps towards understanding my particular space and place, identity, and time. And so that's sort of, I think, pulsing through a lot of the conversations that we're having. I don't know if Nandi or Jolene want to chime in, but I was particularly struck by the ending of Nandi's presentation, when you made that brilliant connection between that through this work with us these last couple of weeks, but really the last couple of years, you make that profound connection with your mother's relationships to objects. In the same way that you're doing it within your professional training, looking at the histories of those colors and those fabrics.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly jump in And it's funny that it took so long to come to that realization, especially as someone who has tirelessly fought to democratize the field of art history and to look beyond these false hierarchies of high and low art. And then to sort of forget that, antiques dealing, there's so many different forms of curation, or even thinking about seed savers, right? And of course, being the partner of a farmer and living out on rocky acres, that is also opened my eyes to thinking more about the tremendous artistry and aesthetic knowledge that goes into planting and growing food. And of course, the dyes and colorants that create the artworks from those resources. And I just want to say that it's been a transformative experience for me, both in the planning and in the execution of this project, and really caused me to think in so many new ways about the work that I do. And it's, very personal as well. So I want to make sure Jolene also gets a chance to jump in with other thoughts.
Yeah, Nadi. I guess I have been thinking about the decolonization of art history, visual culture for a long time. And I think that, your arrival at Cornell was where this conversation really began, because you represented somebody in a field that I had very few colleagues to be able to have a conversation with because of the exclusion of Indigenous consciousness within the original or more colonial structure of the field. And so I really, value that. But then I've also been thinking about how do we move beyond the current state of violence and ongoing coloniality in the Americas. And this is where it coincided with, the inspiration to actually frame a class I'm teaching this semester with the 2-row protocol, and thinking about it as like we had this way of communicating with and being in relationship with arrivants and settlers in the Americas. There's the 2-row. We did this in the early 1600s. And, and so I'm thinking about, is it implausible to actually enact that at this point in time? I don't think so. I think we just have to begin to rethink what these relationships are. And I think part of the rethinking is about repositioning the notion, the authority of the state in our lives. And so, for me, I really think that, this collaboration is what's, really ignited this possibility.
All right, thank you so much, Jolene. We have a question from the audience. Megan asked that our project website talks about the colonial violence of certain words like climate, dispossession, and they are wondering if there are preferred words or ways of talking about this topic, or is it more about making more people aware of the implicit violence or context that these words can carry?
Thanks, Kate. Thank you, Megan, for a great question. It's an important one. I hope that you visit our website, migrationscollab, I believe, .com, if I'm correct, migrationscollab.com. In it, you will find on our overview, our grant narrative. So you can read at length about what we were doing by sort of making an intervention on those words. I'll be brief so colleagues can also address this, and maybe even Sandy. But one of the issues that we had been going through from, as many of you know, not only in this time, but let's say we'll just start around 2016 onward, were sort of the double usages, if you will, across multiple conversations of word like invasive, illegal, alien species. And for those of us that work in the academies, in the humanities, that includes art histories, literatures, anthropologies, the social sciences. We use these words in our own sort of disciplinary logic, in our own disciplinary vacuums, if you will. Scientists on the other side use them in their own way. And oftentimes we think that these words exist only in our usage of them, by how we as a episteme or as a academy defines them. But we know that that's not true because we also live like everyone else in the real world. And so we can see invasive species throughout the 19th century used to talk about certain groups of people, often BIPOC. We can also see the histories of violence against immigrant communities and Native Americans in sort of that slippery slope of categorizations of species, always sort of in a vertical organization of definitions of what is the human being. And so while not proposing a politically correct or not proposing a universally appropriate language, better words to use, what we were really doing as humanists and artists and social scientists is pushing back on the disconnect of the histories of these words and how they function simultaneously. They do many things at once. Whether or not different fields of knowledge makers want to acknowledge that within Western institutions. If you recall, during the first quarantine summer, we had the, I believe it was called the Asian murder hornet? And so all of the reports in the news about this invasive species, right at the time that we saw violence and hate crimes against Asian American and Asian immigrant communities rising in the United States. For those of us that know American 19th century and early 20th century history, the connections are palpable. And so that's really sort of what we were attempting to unpack.
Anyone else want to respond to this question?
Well, I mean, just to echo some of the conversation that Ella set up, when we're thinking about, and when I've been doing research on endemic native flora of the Western US, as you are studying a lot of the sources, phrases, and ways of identifying plants include that invasive, the non-native, the naturalized. Within painting, there's fugitive color. There's a renaming that takes place within the series Codex Rodriguez Mondragon, where I may have the absolute crystal clear identification of a medicinal, ceremonial, utilitarian plant. I'm less interested in its contemporary names, and I'm far more interested in understanding the various names and relationships that demonstrate indigenous knowledge over the region and over time. It is through that recognition and that relationship building of addressing a plant in its actual name that there is a different way of understanding and working with another vascular being.
Thanks so much. We have another audience question, and this one comes from Dorothy Hong, who asks, do you sense competition and tension between USA invasive measure in Mexico coming back, either treasures and artifacts versus Mexican immigrants creating from their native art and injecting their aesthetics? And I read this question as an invitation to perhaps talk a little bit more both about what I see in the question is perhaps a gesture towards borrowing from different traditions or thinking across traditions and histories. And I would invite also, if I can expand on the question, I would invite you each to say more about the place of interdisciplinarity in your work. Sandy, I was really struck by your description of the map on that first, I think it was the first slide that you showed, and the many different, you talked about collapsing time and space and the many different kinds of knowledge that you're drawing on. I wonder if I can turn it back to you to take up this question about thinking about aesthetics across practices and across traditions, and then maybe also, again, the interdisciplinary question.
In terms of aesthetics across the series Codex Rodriguez Mondragon, while I am third generation painter of Mexican and Chicana artists, My grandfather is from Cintalapa, Chiapas, which is closer to the Guatemalan border. My grandmother's artistic practice begun in Aguascalientes. There has been generations of migration, forced migration from the revolution to politics and to economics within the United States. I will say that the opportunity to move away from the Euro-identified kind of classical drawing and iconography that had become so much a part of the work that I had done in museums, to be able to really think about the economy of line, the gestures, the postures, the 16th century Nahuatl visual cues, and the synthesis of multiple kinds of ways of representing the world, including mapping, including portraits, including a variety of sources, allows me as a Chicana to draw from a number of traditions in the Americas and create a very 2022 version of what I call a codex, which is a visual narrative that is intended to be performed, that is intended to engage generations and people from various backgrounds. So it's both the material, it's both the iconography, and a number of layered conversations within it. Yeah.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to pick up on that? Jolene, would you like to respond? I'm also interested in maybe coming back to your work that is both responding to legal and physical violence, and then the role of art in those responses too. I'll just add that also I would be especially interested in hearing more about the piece that's only visible in the border checkpoint, but I'll leave the broader question on the table for you.
Right. Well, I've taken the position that art is anticipatory. And so at this point in time, a number of Indigenous artists are integrating legal matter into their artistic practice. And I think this is really important because the legal system, just like science, is another kind of imaginary. And so I think that moving it into the aesthetic realm is beginning to locate these discussions as all kind of imagined spaces. And so how we have to rethink how these spaces interact with each other, I think, is what the artwork affords us. And so the border checkpoint of Alan Michelson's work is, I think, a significant piece in this way, because it's bringing the history of the two-row, the indication of it in that strong image, but at the same time, it's also ironic in that, you know, you can only see that piece if you're detained in the border checkpoint. And the border checkpoint is actually an intervention between, you know, in the homelands of the Haudenosaunee people. And so why is it okay that in our homelands, our place in the world, that we have to be interrupted by these new settler states? And so I do think that art becomes a way to begin to open these discussions. I don't think art is, you know, the only way, but I do think that it's a really public way to continuously open the discussion. But I'd just like to give Nandi a chance to respond as well. So thank you for that question.
Sorry, I did my rookie Zoom move. I said that I would, I'm happy to briefly respond to the interdisciplinarity question. I think that this experience, coupled with my experiences of co-authorship with both Ella Diaz and with my colleague Elena Fitzpatrick-Sifford, has really opened my eyes to collaboration amongst women of color as radical praxis, and the inevitable interdisciplinary and intergenerational conversations and collaborations that come out of that. And I think that for so much of my training and my formation as a scholar was very much circumscribed to a particular historiography. And there were so many cues and so many sort of subtle reminders that, you know, don't go beyond those fences. You need to stick with your field. And there's, of course, the double pressure of feeling like you really need to know the field backwards and forwards in your own discipline to be taken seriously as a scholar that has been in an academy that has been historically so hostile to women of color. And so to be able to embark in this journey now, at least for me as a associate professor with tenure and with some more maturity and stability, I realize that I will never do my work the same, it's always going to be different from here on out. And so this is, for me, is a huge, I guess, paradigm shift. And I'm grateful to be in deep conversation and thought with my collaborators, because there is there's so much more out there beyond the small disciplinary silos that people attempt to place us into, and just infinite ways of making these brilliant connections and beautiful connections across time and space and aesthetics and people and histories. And I think we have one final question for Ella, and so I'll let Kate take that away and Ella to respond.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for that. We have one final question from the audience for Ella, and it says, can you elaborate on the 3 C's, and specifically, what does this look, sound, and feel like when you're cooking in the kitchen?
Thank you. And so I'm so excited that I got asked this, because this is my new thing. And it begins in poetry with Alarista and his use of hard C's in certain poems about Chicanidad. So this is Floricanto of the 60s and 70s. And a very famous professor emeritus, I forget his first name, but Professor Villanueva writes about the hard sound C of C's invoking pride. So I always think about the poetics of saying convivencia, comida, and conversation. And then the last being, moving into English, because yo soy Chicana, right? And what it actually is too, is it brings together, I am an interdisciplinarian, so I've always been playing in the middle. And the one point I wanted to make is it's only until I'd say the early 21st century, maybe the 2010s, that we're now beginning to see what Nani was referring to, that paradigm shift. We're beginning to see more Latinx art history, Chicanx art histories happening in disciplines of art history. There was a study done on where all of the Chicanx art histories were being done in the 90s and the 2000s, and it wasn't taking place in art history departments, because so much of this work is interdisciplinary. All of that to say, in the early 2000s, you have contemporary art movement of relational aesthetics. This involves a French curator and concept of people making things together inside of the museums. And for some of us that know 60s and 70s history, and we could really look at other histories, but looking at those civil rights histories, that kind of rubbed us the wrong way, knowing that everyone from the American Indian movement, the Black Panther Party, the Brown Berets, which all had components of art making and food making, cooking in their kitchens to nourish young people going to school, to gather together, and to also that nourishment is a word that means many things, not just one thing. And so then to see in the early 2000s that now cooking was taking place in museums as a form of like an art intervention or a happening, which is another older term from the 60s. It was a little strange how practices that have always been essential to telling not just BIPOC communities, but all of our stories. We've all cooked in kitchens. We've all shared knowledges with various family members or friends that create memory, and memory is a part of knowledge. So that's sort of the origin of that. It sort of is speaking back to contemporary art history that really erases and elides these earlier histories and calls them political. Then it also speaks to Chicana educational praxis. I'm thinking of Professor Rebecca Berciaga in particular, a lot of the work that she's done around testimonial, especially the older guard of the Latina feminist group. But this isn't certainly limited knowledge to Latinx and Chicanx fields. And so working with Jolene and also being able to sit and eat dinner with several Haudenosaunee people of the different nations, and believe it or not, be quiet and actually listen to the things that they have to say about coming into knowledge, to hear Professor Mount Pleasant explain to me not just the agricultural science between the mounds, but then simply to turn to their cultural meaning, and it's not split at the root. That for a second, I could gaze another way of experiencing knowledge. I'm too Western. I've been too compartmentalized in the academic tradition, as well as a Chicana growing up in institutional knowledge. I didn't mean to ramble if anyone else wants to chime in, but it's a wonderful question. And I'm glad you brought it back to this, because it encompasses so much, as I hope that we demonstrated today through our different approaches.
Thanks. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. And I want to take just a minute to thank once more visiting artist Sandy Rodriguez and Professors Cona Ponte, Diaz, and Rickard, and my co-moderator, Kate Foster. Thanks to all of you for sharing your knowledges with us today and your experience. Thanks to the eCornell team for producing today's webinar and the series. And I'll remind everyone that you can continue to follow this project on migrationcollab.com. We encourage you to check that out. And you can see more about what's coming up with migrations at Cornell at migrations.cornell.edu. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.